Now we're getting to the juicy stuff. Discussions about the creation of Sparta's constitutional settlement normally revolve around the basic facts, such as what the elements of it were, when they happened, and by whom. I want to take a different approach and look at where the pressures for change came from, and how they came together in the eventual political settlement. I've titled this chapter Top Down or Bottom Up, Lycurgus or the People, to therefore capture two questions. Was this an imposed or a communal reform? And were its origins in the past, or the immediacy of the Messenian War at around the end of the 8th century BC? Let's begin by assessing Sparta's situation at the end of the Messenian War. In enslaving the Messenians en masse, Sparta committed the closest thing to a war crime in ancient Greece. But instead of obliterating the Messenians that they had just grievously wronged, as over 2,000 years later Machiavelli would recommend, the Spartans ended up building their new society upon the Messenian helots' backs. This was shaky foundations to say the least, and the Spartans knew it. Given what would come, there is a temptation to call them paranoid, but the problem with that is that they weren't. And it wouldn't be long before the Spartans' worst nightmares came true, and the Messenians were back with a vengeance. For the moment, though, Sparta stood in the ruins of its own victory. Decades of total war had crippled the polis and caused immense stress and strife. And it is now that we see evidence of real structural changes in the Spartan polity. The most important piece of information we have is something known to historians as the rhetra, a piece of constitutional text that reads, "But should the people speak crookedly, the Gerousia and kings should set this aside." What on earth does this mean? The rhetra is attributed to the reign of one king Theopompus, whose reign just so happens to coincide with the close of the Messenian War. In other words, this gives us a date for events in an otherwise fairly dateless study. The rhetra is either an amendment or an appendage, depending upon how you interpret events, to a law known as the Great Rhetra. This is the only Spartan law that we have in writing, for reasons we will come to shortly. The Great Rhetra states, in summary, that the people of Sparta are to be separated or categorized into tribes and clans, that a Gerousia, a council or senatorial body, is to be set up, and finally, quote, "But the demos, the people, must have the decision and the power." This is a lot to explain. It is likely that the rhetra officializes some things, such as the social organization of society and the Gerousia. A more interesting question is whether it officializes or creates the assembly, the official participatory body of Spartan citizens, that would allow the demos to have the decision and the power. I mean, when you stop and think about it, for a supposedly fascio-communist military state, Sparta may in fact have had one of the very first inklings of something approaching participatory politics and even democracy. The question for our study then is what the nature and timing of the rhetra is. If it is the case that the Great Rhetra dates to before the rhetra, perhaps even up to a century before, then the rhetra can be understood as an amendment added to the rhetra by the rulers of Sparta during the crisis of the Messenian War. In this case, it reads perhaps as an opportunistic or exacerbated move to stymie Sparta's proto-democracy and deprive Spartan citizens of power, in which case it takes the form of an oligarchic coup, since it nullifies the assembly at any point the Gerousia desires. It may also simply be that the rhetra is a piece of emergency legislation to ensure that the war effort can proceed without hindrance from social strife. But on the other hand, if the rhetra and Great Rhetra actually date together, then it is my proposition that together they demonstrate a more populist, at least communal political reform, in which all of the different power groups are trying to have their say and politically outmaneuver the others. In this light, the rhetra can be seen as the Spartan aristocrats attempting to simply cling on to their former power pre-Messenia and cement their continued place in the new system. A possible third alternative, and the most charitable, would be that the rhetra is simply an attempt at preventing political gridlock. In other words, an honest attempt at creating a working constitution and balancing the tenuous situation of Sparta at the time. To add some clues to this study, let's return to the mythology of Sparta that we left unfinished, because Sparta would come to express a narrative of exactly how it got its laws, the laws the real 300 Spartans would fight and die for. In this version, during the Dark Age, a legendary lawgiver called Lycurgus works with the oracle at Delphi and produces all of the laws that Sparta would ever need. Lycurgus takes the place therefore of a Moses-like figure, delivering inalienable law to shape the entirety of politics, law and society. In fact, these laws are definitely what we today would call totalitarian, and to us Lycurgus would probably represent the worst kind of North Korean-style rule. None of Lycurgus's laws were written down, save the Great Rhetra, apparently by his own order. This is something of a red flag, no, for tyranny, corruption, or simply that he is made up. Because of these things, many historians think that the laws of Sparta were attributed to a sage of the Dark Ages to give them some precedent and heritage. This would certainly be something useful for new laws created in the immediacy of the Messenian crisis. For those that follow my channel, this will mean that Sparta is trying to make its revolution look like a renaissance. They're remembering forgotten Lycurgan lore. But also, at a time that precedes proper history, the Spartans are doing what every society does, which is creating a sense of itself through myth-making. The problem is not just in the lack of evidence for Lycurgus. If he did exist prior to our Sparta, then he is evidently some combination of genius and prophet, because he mentions things that are very evidently hallmarks of later Greek life. For those historians that like the idea that Lycurgus was a real person, some resort to placing his existence around 700 BC and even later into the 600s. Now, if this were true, he sort of played a similar role to Margaret Thatcher in the UK, who a few decades after World War II implemented her own dramatic reforms to the British state and way of life. It's not impossible that Lycurgus comes after the Great Rhetra and after the creation of the new Spartan constitution, because he would then be creating a set of laws that would be implemented via that constitution and create the social revolution of Sparta, which we will come to in the next chapter. In fact, given that this social revolution comes after the political, this does make sense. The only problem with it is the lack of evidence that Lycurgus did exist at this time. This is problematic because we do know of other people, important people, who existed here. Is it really the case that Lycurgus' existence was in effect covered up and pushed back several centuries? It's hard to rule anything out with the Spartans, but it does seem to me that a much simpler hypothesis is that Lycurgus either never existed, or that he is a folk hero with much later actions attributed to him. If we turn and look at the actual situation of Sparta to the end of and post the Messenian War, we see that the situation was absolutely fertile for constitutional change from all the groups within Sparta, and thus the constitution that develops is a result of multiple factions and power plays at work. Remember that Spartan citizens have just spent the past decades fighting, dying, and eventually winning a terrible war. A war in which people can literally be born, grow up, and then die in. Just as World War I and World War II would have profound social consequences in many Western countries, it is hard to see that the same wouldn't have happened to Sparta. Its citizens would have been armed, experienced, used to solving matters by force, and at the same time both desperate and not blind to the fact that Sparta had just conquered an enormous area of rich land by its own blood. Imagine now if the aristocracy simply swooped in and took it all for themselves. Certainly visions of the Winter Palace spring up in my mind. The exact dating of when Messenian land was allotted to every Spartan citizen, which is something we'll look at more in the next chapter, is uncertain. However, I personally would venture that it was not simply later redistributed to the Spartan citizenry, but was either held in suspension or over some years surveyed and allotted. Because otherwise, you would have the same kind of destructive strife that occurs whenever one group simply takes from another. And this matters because Sparta seems to have avoided this specific kind of problem. It also gives weight to the input of the average citizenry, the general acceptance of the final settlement, and the reason why Sparta and Spartans would become so reactionary and committed to their laws, since they had all had a part in forming them and now had a clear and guaranteed stake in the new system. I'm loath to use modern terminology to describe ancient events and peoples and things, but if I have to use a modern reference, we might like to think of this as an ideal communist revolution, in which the mass of people are placated by a large grant of land and thus wealth. And certainly it was the case that getting the land of the kulaks encourages the larger mass of Russian peasants to support the communist takeover. But Sparta had an extra advantage in this regard that further reduced internal resistance to the change. Firstly, they were distributing the land of the Messenians and not other Laconians, and the Messenians didn't have a say in this. Secondly, for reasons we'll have to omit this time, it appears that a very large chunk of the population left Sparta for a colony in modern-day Italy around this time. Now, this is remarkably similar to what happened post the Cuban Revolution, where half of the population against Castro's communism left for Miami, and the other half that supported it stayed. I strongly suspect that this is one of the reasons why Cuba had nothing like the same kind of mass deaths that other communist states had, and I suspect it also played a big role here, both as regards to the Spartan demos' successful demands, and the overall smoothness of the political revolution itself. Because what was left was a smaller group of passionate Spartans who were able to present a united front. Therefore, in all of this context, perhaps we might see the Great Rhetra as some kind of a conservative act to cement some of the more established mores and practices and provide stability, things that everybody already understood and could now clearly cite. There is also another defining development, which is the creation of the office of Ephor. The Ephors are not mentioned in the Great Rhetra. This may be because they were created sometime after, or because the aristocrats were trying to downplay this radical political body, so it doesn't write it down. It may even simply be that it wasn't written down, although that does seem odd, especially since the Ephors would become the most powerful political body in the new Spartan constitution. Yes, believe it or not, that scene in 300 where King Leonidas has to obey the Ephors is in fact a true representation of where political power ultimately lay. The centrality of the Ephors to the new system suggests that it arose during a pivotal moment, though whether this is at the end of the Messenian War, or, as we shall see in the next chapter, the Second Messenian War, is uncertain. Arguments could be made both ways, either that the centrality of the Ephors make it likely that they arise at the same time as the rest of the political development, or that their extreme nature suggests that there arose dissatisfaction with the earlier compromise, either through growing discontent or the crisis caused by the Second Messenian War. Either way, given its power, it's hard to argue that the Ephors are anything other than a demand from the citizenry for a truly executive body within the constitution. So, whatever the origins of Sparta's constitution, what we do have is a fairly good idea of how the Spartan constitution worked in later years, such as during the time of the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae. Originally, Sparta operates like a fairly ordinary Greek city, with a monarchy and an aristocracy that operates as an uncodified council. With the advent of the Great Rhetra, the council is transformed into the Gerousia, a senatorial body of 30 men, including Sparta's 2 kings, who presumably had pride of place. Any man over 60 could become a member, and the position was for life. The Gerousia thus resembles something like an upper house in a parliamentary system, but they also probably acted like a jury, and they communicated directly with the Assembly, the official political body of Spartan citizens. Now, the real power lays in the Ephors. There was only 5 in total, and they only served for 1 year each. They were elected from the Spartan citizens, and they oversaw the Gerousia, presenting cases only if they saw fit. Since Sparta had all the laws it needed, supposedly, officially Ephors wouldn't have been legislators so much as interpreters, although, since the laws weren't written down, in practice these are the same things. Legislation, so to speak, might be passed to the Gerousia for appraisal and in turn to the Assembly. A generous interpretation of the rider to the Great Rhetra would be to suggest that it prevented the Assembly making any amendments to legislation that altered the original intention of that legislation. In general then, the Ephors conducted central government, acting as executive. They could put the kings on trial. They acted as dual prosecutor and judge in some trials, and they could also arbitrarily punish Spartan citizens for perceived infractions. They also met ambassadors from other states. As for Sparta's 2 kings, they retained their place in the council, and they would lead Sparta's armies, but otherwise they appeared to take the form of somewhat of a rogue political element, something not quite worked out from the older system, and 2 Ephors would always accompany kings abroad, which shows an attempt to keep an eye on them. You can definitely see how Frank Miller and the 300 film played on this notion, by turning Leonidas quite literally into a rogue general. I think the Ephors are so important because they somewhat define the new Spartan constitution and crystallization of its military culture. They are the embodiment of the true empowerment and equality of the Spartan citizens. At the same time, just because Sparta had supposedly open elections doesn't mean that the people with more power and influence didn't end up more often in the seats of power than those without. This certainly happens in our modern democratic institutions. Ephors were chosen by the level of applause they got. It's thus rather obvious that the more influence a Spartite had, the more cheers they would get, and Aristotle wrote skeptically, in fact mockingly, of Sparta's constitution. From a modern perspective then, the Spartan constitution appears to be all over the place. It has 2 kings that are somewhat symbolic, somewhat free agents. It has an oligarchy of 5 Ephors, but they're chosen from the people on the basis of applause. It also has a senate of 30, and an assembly of the people that could nonetheless be vetoed at any time. But I think that it is precisely because Sparta's constitution defies modern terminology, why it doesn't fit the neat, abstract definitions of political scientists and technocrats, that in fact it worked. It was organic. It was exactly what Sparta needed at the time to deal with its situation, and that is all that a constitution ever should be. Of course, the problem with it was that it rested upon that huge class of recently enslaved helots, and they certainly hadn't forgotten what freedom was like. In the second part of the story behind the real Sparta and the real 300 Spartans, We're going to see how the Messenians rose up and made Sparta's worst nightmare come true. And it is from this nightmare that Sparta completes the revolution of its society and produces the world's most famous soldiers, the 300. So, top down or bottom up, Lycurgus or the people, the result was a Sparta that would be able to live up to its lofty mythos. The Sparta of legend would come true.